The morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage, casting golden streaks across the bedroom where 3 children were already wide awake. Prince George sat on the edge of his bed, his fingers nervously adjusting the collar of his pajamas. At 10 years old, he understood what today meant. His grandfather was about to become king, and the whole world would be watching. Princess Charlotte stood before her mirror, practicing the careful curtsy her mother had taught her. She was 8 years old and determined to do everything perfectly. Little Prince Louis, just 5 years old, bounced on his bed with the kind of energy only small children possess on important days. Kate Middleton walked into the room with a gentle smile. She wore a simple robe, her hair still down, looking every bit the mother rather than the Princess of Wales. She knew her children needed her calm presence this morning more than anything else. William followed close behind, already dressed in his formal military uniform, though his jacket was still unbuttoned. He looked at his 3 children with a mixture of pride and concern. Today would be long and demanding for them all. The family had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The coronation of King Charles III was not just a historical event for the nation, but a deeply personal milestone for their family. George, Charlotte, and Louis had attended special rehearsals at Westminster Abbey, learning exactly where to sit, when to stand, and how to behave during the lengthy ceremony. The children had asked countless questions. George wanted to know why his grandfather needed a special crown. Charlotte wondered if the queen consort would wear a princess dress. Louis simply wanted to know if there would be cake afterward. Kate knelt down beside Louis, smoothing his tousled hair. She had always been hands-on with her children, refusing to let royal protocol create distance between them. William joined them on the floor, gathering all 3 children close. They formed a small circle, a private moment before the public spectacle began. William reminded them that while today was important, they should simply be themselves. Kate added that if anyone felt overwhelmed, they could look to her and she would be there. Breakfast was served in the family's dining room, though none of them ate much. The children picked at their toast and fruit while their parents sipped coffee and tea. The household staff moved quietly around them, understanding the magnitude of the day. Security personnel had been stationed around the property since dawn. Outside the gates, photographers had already gathered, hoping for a glimpse of the family before they departed for Westminster Abbey. Charlotte asked her mother if her dress was pretty enough. Kate assured her that she looked absolutely beautiful. The young princess wore a delicate white dress with silver embroidery, designed by the same team that had created Kate's outfit. George's uniform was a miniature version of his father's, making him look remarkably grown up. Louis wore a smart navy suit that Kate had fought to keep simple and comfortable, knowing her youngest son would struggle with anything too restrictive. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere in the household grew more focused. Hairstylists and makeup artists arrived to help Kate prepare. William checked and rechecked the schedule with his private secretary. The children were taken to a separate room where they could relax before getting into their formal attire. A member of staff read them stories, trying to keep their minds occupied and their energy levels manageable. Kate's transformation took time and precision. Her ivory dress, designed by Alexander McQueen, was a masterpiece of embroidery and craftsmanship. The gown featured delicate floral motifs representing the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. Her headpiece was equally significant, a reworked version of a tiara with deep royal history. As stylists worked on her hair and makeup, Kate remained remarkably calm. She had learned over the years that staying centered helped everyone around her stay focused too. William watched his wife's preparation with quiet admiration. They had been through so much together, from university students to parents of 3, from Duke and Duchess to Prince and Princess of Wales. Today marked another chapter in their extraordinary journey. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. No words were needed. They understood each other perfectly after all these years together. When it was time to dress the children, the household became a flurry of activity. George stood still and serious as his uniform was adjusted. He had inherited his father's sense of duty and understood the responsibility that came with being the eldest child. Charlotte twirled in her dress, delighted by how it moved when she spun. She possessed her mother's grace and her father's confidence, a combination that served her well in public appearances. Louis, however, was growing restless. Kate distracted him with promises of waving to the crowds and riding in the grand cars. The family gathered in the main hallway for a final check before departure. William straightened George's collar one last time. Kate adjusted Charlotte's headband and made sure Louis's shoes were properly tied. They looked at each other, this family of 5, knowing they were about to step into history. Photographers had been allowed inside for a few official photographs, capturing the family in their private moments before the public event began. The cars arrived precisely on schedule. The family would travel in a formal procession to Westminster Abbey, joining other members of the royal family in the journey through London's streets. As they stepped outside, the children blinked in the bright sunlight. The sound of crowds could already be heard in the distance, thousands of people lining the route to catch a glimpse of the royal family. George climbed into the car first, followed by Charlotte and then Louis. Kate and William took their seats, positioning themselves so they could easily manage all 3 children during the journey. As the motorcade began to move, the reality of the day settled over them. This was no longer rehearsal or preparation. This was the actual coronation, and millions of people around the world would be watching every moment. Kate reached across the seat, taking William's hand once more. Together, they would guide their children through this historic day, protecting them while also allowing them to be part of something extraordinary. The motorcade moved slowly through the streets of London, giving the massive crowds lining the route ample opportunity to see the royal family. Inside the car, Prince Louis pressed his face against the window, his eyes wide with wonder at the sea of people waving flags and cheering. Kate gently reminded him to sit back and wave properly, demonstrating the subtle hand movement that had become her signature gesture over the years. Charlotte copied her mother perfectly, her small hand moving in the same elegant pattern. George sat more formally, understanding that as future king his behavior was being scrutinized even now. The streets were decorated beyond anything the children had ever seen. Union Jack flags hung from every lamppost and building. Giant screens had been erected at intervals, so crowds further from Westminster Abbey could watch the ceremony. Street performers entertained the waiting masses while vendors sold commemorative items. The atmosphere was festive yet respectful, a celebration of continuity and tradition. William pointed out various landmarks to his children as they passed, trying to make the journey educational as well as ceremonial. Kate noticed Louis beginning to fidget. She had prepared for this, bringing small items to keep him occupied during the long day ahead. She whispered something to him that made him giggle, instantly lightening the mood inside the car. William smiled at his wife's ability to balance the formal requirements of their position with the practical needs of being parents. It was one of the qualities he admired most about her. As they approached Westminster Abbey, the crowds grew even denser. Security personnel lined the route in greater numbers, their presence a reminder of the security concerns that always accompanied major royal events. Police officers on horseback controlled the crowds while other officers stood at regular intervals along the barriers. Overhead, the distant sound of helicopters could be heard, both news media and security forces monitoring everything from above. The car finally pulled up to the entrance of Westminster Abbey, and the moment the family had been preparing for arrived. William stepped out first, his military uniform gleaming in the sunlight. He turned to help Kate, who emerged with practiced grace despite the intricate gown she wore. The cameras captured every second, every angle, every expression. Then came the children. George stepped out with shoulders back and head high, looking remarkably mature for his age. Charlotte followed, remembering to smile at the cameras as her mother had taught her. Louis emerged last, immediately overwhelmed by the noise and spectacle surrounding him. The family paused at the entrance, allowing photographers to capture their arrival. This brief moment felt eternal to Kate, who was acutely aware of her youngest son's unpredictability. She kept one hand gently on Louis's shoulder, a subtle reminder to stay focused. William stood beside George, a silent show of support for his eldest son who bore the weight of future kingship on his young shoulders. Charlotte stood between her brothers, naturally falling into the role of peacekeeper she often played within the family. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere was completely different from the carnival-like celebration outside. The ancient church was cool and quiet, filled with the scent of flowers and candles. Rows of chairs had been arranged with military precision, each seat assigned to a specific guest. World leaders, foreign royalty, religious figures, and dignitaries from across the Commonwealth filled the abbey. Everyone wore their finest clothing, creating a spectacular display of colors, medals, and jewelry. The family was escorted to their designated seats near the front of the abbey. This positioning meant they would have a clear view of the entire ceremony, but it also meant they would be visible to everyone in attendance and to the cameras broadcasting the event worldwide. Kate settled Louis between herself and Charlotte, hoping her daughter's calm demeanor would help keep her brother steady. William sat beside George, ready to guide him through the various stages of the ceremony. The organ began playing softly as the last guests took their seats. The children looked around in awe at the magnificent Gothic architecture surrounding them. Stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the stone floors. Ancient banners hung from the walls, representing centuries of British history. Charlotte whispered to her mother, asking about the different symbols and decorations. Kate answered quietly, grateful for her daughter's curiosity, which seemed to calm her own nerves. Louis began swinging his legs, his feet not quite reaching the floor. Kate placed a gentle hand on his knee, and he stilled momentarily before starting again. She knew this would be a constant challenge throughout the ceremony. A 5-year-old boy was simply not designed to sit still for hours, regardless of how important the occasion. William caught her eye and gave her an encouraging smile. They were in this together as always. The ceremony was about to begin and a hush fell over the abbey. Senior members of the royal family began processing down the aisle, each taking their designated positions. The children watched their relatives pass by, recognizing aunts, uncles, and cousins among the formal procession. Some smiled at them discreetly. Others maintained completely serious expressions focused on their ceremonial duties. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The organ music swelled to a triumphant volume, and King Charles III began his procession into Westminster Abbey. He walked with measured steps, his face serious and contemplative. Behind him came Queen Camilla, her expression serene. The weight of the moment was visible on both their faces. This was not just a ceremony but a sacred oath, a promise to serve the nation for the rest of their lives. George watched his grandfather with intense focus. Kate noticed her eldest son's expression and felt a pang of emotion. George was watching his own future unfold before him, seeing what would one day be expected of him. William noticed too and placed a reassuring hand on his son's arm. Charlotte leaned forward, trying to see everything clearly. Louis momentarily forgot to fidget, captivated by the spectacle and pageantry surrounding him. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood at the altar, ready to conduct the coronation ceremony. The ancient ritual had been performed in variations for over 1,000 years, connecting this modern moment to centuries of British history. Every word spoken, every gesture made, carried deep symbolic meaning. The children had learned about these symbols in their preparation, but seeing them performed in reality was completely different from any lesson. As the ceremony progressed, Kate kept a watchful eye on all 3 of her children. She knew the cameras were on them, capturing their reactions, their behavior, every small movement. The pressure was immense, but she also felt pride. Her children were handling this extraordinary situation with remarkable composure. Even Louis, despite his age, seemed to understand that something important was happening. The coronation ceremony reached its most sacred moments, and the entire abbey fell into profound silence. King Charles knelt before the altar while the Archbishop of Canterbury prepared to anoint him with holy oil. This part of the ceremony was considered so sacred that screens were positioned to shield it from cameras, maintaining the private spiritual nature of the ritual. The children watched the screens being positioned, and Charlotte whispered a question to her mother about why this part couldn't be filmed. Kate explained quietly that some moments were meant to be between the king and God alone. George sat completely still during this solemn portion of the ceremony. His young face showed concentration as he tried to understand the magnitude of what was happening. William glanced at his son and saw a reflection of himself at that age, always aware of the destiny that awaited him. It was both a blessing and a burden, this knowledge of future responsibility. William had spent years coming to terms with it, and now he watched his own son beginning that same journey. Louis, however, was reaching the limits of his patience. He had been remarkably well behaved for nearly an hour, but 5-year-olds can only manage so much stillness. He began to squirm in his seat, looking around at the elaborate decorations rather than focusing on the ceremony. Kate noticed immediately and reached into a small bag she had brought, producing a tiny object that she discreetly handed to him. It was enough to distract him for a few more minutes. Charlotte, ever the responsible older sister, also leaned toward Louis and whispered something that made him settle down. The anointing completed. The screens were removed and the public portion of the ceremony resumed. King Charles was dressed in his coronation robes, magnificent golden garments heavy with symbolism and tradition. The robes had been used in previous coronations, connecting this moment to the long line of monarchs who had come before. The children stared at their grandfather, who now looked transformed into something almost otherworldly. The man who had played with them and told them stories was now draped in ancient regalia, becoming the living embodiment of the monarchy itself. The moment arrived for the actual crowning. The archbishop lifted St. Edward's crown high above the king's head. The crown was made of solid gold and set with hundreds of precious stones. It weighed nearly 5 pounds and had been used in coronations for over 3 centuries. The abbey held its breath as the crown was lowered onto King Charles's head. At that exact moment, trumpets sounded throughout the building, their bright notes soaring up to the vaulted ceiling. The children jumped slightly at the sudden noise, and Louis grabbed his mother's hand tightly. George understood what had just happened. His grandfather was now officially king in the eyes of the church, the state, and the people. Charlotte clapped her hands together softly, excited by the triumphant music filling the abbey. Louis looked confused but caught up in the excitement around him. Kate felt tears threatening to fall but maintained her composure. This was William's father being crowned, a moment of profound significance for her husband and their family. After the king was crowned, it was Queen Camilla's turn. Her ceremony was shorter but equally meaningful. She was anointed and crowned with a different crown, modified specifically for this occasion. The queen consort's crown sparkled with diamonds that caught the light from hundreds of candles throughout the abbey. Charlotte was particularly mesmerized by this part of the ceremony. Leaning forward in her seat to see better, she whispered to her mother that the queen looked like a fairy tale princess, and Kate smiled at her daughter's innocent observation. The ceremony continued with various religious readings, prayers, and musical performances. The abbey's choir sang ancient hymns that had been performed at coronations for generations. Their voices filled the massive space with ethereal sound that seemed to come from heaven itself. George closed his eyes at one point, simply listening to the music and letting it wash over him. Charlotte swayed slightly to the rhythm, her natural grace evident even while seated. Louis had discovered that he could make his feet swing in time with the music, which kept him occupied and relatively quiet. William and Kate exchanged glances throughout the ceremony, silently communicating about their children's behavior and the enormity of what they were witnessing. They had attended many royal events together over the years, but this was different. This was the coronation of a king, something that happens perhaps once in a lifetime. Their children would remember this day forever, and William and Kate wanted to ensure those memories were positive ones. As the ceremony progressed toward its conclusion, there came a moment that the family had discussed extensively during preparation. King Charles would receive the official homage of his family and senior members of the nobility. William would be the first to approach his father, kneeling before the new king and pledging his loyalty and service. This was not just ceremonial theater, but a genuine declaration of allegiance and support. For William, it meant publicly acknowledging his father as sovereign while also recognizing his own eventual path to the throne. Kate watched as her husband stood and prepared to make his way to the altar. She felt George tense beside her and realized their son was worried about his father. She leaned close to George and whispered that Daddy was simply going to speak with Grandpa, that everything was planned and nothing was wrong. George nodded but kept his eyes fixed on William as he walked down the aisle. William knelt before his father with practiced precision. He had rehearsed this moment many times, but the reality of it carried emotional weight that rehearsals could never capture. He spoke the words of homage clearly and firmly, his voice carrying throughout the abbey. When he finished, King Charles reached down and embraced his son warmly. It was a brief break in the formality of the ceremony, a father hugging his son, and it brought tears to many eyes throughout the abbey. The cameras captured this tender moment, and around the world, people watching felt the genuine love between father and son. When William returned to his seat, George looked at him with new understanding. Charlotte reached across to pat her father's arm, sensing that he was emotional even though he showed no outward sign. Louis simply seemed relieved to have his father back beside him. Kate squeezed William's hand, knowing how significant that moment had been for him. He had just sworn allegiance to his father as king, formally recognizing the changed relationship between them, while also affirming his support. The ceremony was drawing to a close, and the children's energy was fading fast. They had been sitting for nearly 2 hours, which was an incredible achievement for children their ages. Kate could see exhaustion creeping across all 3 faces. The final blessing was pronounced over the newly crowned king and queen, and the organ began playing the recessional music. This signaled that the ceremony was complete, and the formal procession out of Westminster Abbey would begin. King Charles and Queen Camilla stood from their thrones, now wearing their crowns and full regalia. They began the slow walk back down the aisle, moving with measured dignity despite the heavy weight of their ceremonial clothing and crowns. Every eye in the abbey followed them, and cameras captured every step of their journey. As the king and queen passed the row where William and Kate sat with their children, something beautiful happened. King Charles paused momentarily and caught the eyes of his 3 grandchildren. Despite the formality of the occasion and the weight of the crown on his head, his expression softened into a look of pure grandfatherly love. Charlotte gave him the biggest smile, momentarily forgetting all protocol. George nodded solemnly, understanding that this was not the moment for casual interaction. Louis waved enthusiastically, his small hand moving back and forth with unbridled excitement. The brief exchange lasted only seconds, but it was captured by countless cameras and would become one of the most shared images of the entire day. After the king and queen passed, other members of the royal family began their procession out of the abbey. The family had been instructed on the precise order and timing of this departure. William and Kate would leave with their children after several other senior royals, but before many of the other guests. This positioning reflected their status as the Prince and Princess of Wales, second in line to the throne after William himself. As they waited for their turn, Kate helped the children stand and shake out their stiff legs. Louis complained that his feet had fallen asleep, and Charlotte quietly explained the tingling sensation he was feeling. When their moment came, the family stood and began walking down the aisle. William led the way, with George walking beside him in a show of father-son solidarity. Kate followed with Charlotte and Louis on either side of her. The walk down the aisle felt endless to the children, who were acutely aware of thousands of eyes watching their every move. Charlotte maintained perfect posture, channeling her mother's grace. George kept his expression serious and focused, looking far older than his 10 years. Louis alternated between walking normally and doing a sort of skip-hop that Kate gently discouraged with subtle guidance. The sunlight outside the abbey was blinding after the dimmer interior. The family emerged to the sound of massive crowds cheering and waving flags. The noise was overwhelming, a wall of sound that seemed to come from every direction. Military bands played patriotic music while church bells rang throughout London. The children blinked rapidly, adjusting to both the bright light and the incredible volume of the celebration surrounding them. Kate bent down quickly to Louis, checking that he was okay with all the noise. He nodded enthusiastically, clearly energized by the excitement rather than frightened by it. The family was guided to their waiting car for the procession back to Buckingham Palace. This journey would be longer and more exposed than their arrival that morning. The route had been designed to allow as many people as possible to see the newly crowned king and the royal family. Barriers lined the streets for miles, behind which stood crowds that had been gathering since the night before. Some people had camped out for days to secure the best viewing positions. As their car joined the procession, the children pressed against the windows, amazed by the sheer number of people. The streets were a sea of red, white, and blue, with Union Jack flags waving everywhere they looked. Strangers held up signs with messages of congratulation and support. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, waving smaller flags with pure joy on their faces. Elderly people stood with tears streaming down their faces, having waited decades to witness a coronation. The overwhelming love and support from the public was palpable, filling the air with a sense of national unity. George noticed that many people were holding up signs specifically for him, calling him future King George and Prince George. The weight of these expectations sat visibly on his young shoulders, and William noticed his son's expression becoming more serious. He placed a hand on George's shoulder and reminded him that he didn't need to think about that distant future today. Today was about celebrating his grandfather and being part of their family. George seemed to relax slightly at his father's words. Charlotte had discovered that when she waved energetically, the crowds responded with even greater enthusiasm. She experimented with different types of waves, finding that the classic royal wave her mother had taught her generated the best reaction. She took great pride in this, feeling like she was successfully fulfilling her royal duty. Kate watched her daughter with a mixture of amusement and pride. Charlotte had a natural instinct for public relations that would serve her well in the years to come. Louis was having the time of his life. He waved at everyone, made faces that sent children in the crowd into fits of laughter, and provided a running commentary on everything he saw. At one point, he spotted a dog in the crowd wearing a tiny crown and became obsessed with finding more dogs. Kate tried to keep him focused on waving to the people, but Louis's attention span was stretched to its limit. She made a mental note that future long ceremonies would need to include more breaks for her youngest son. The procession moved at a walking pace, ensuring everyone along the route had time to see the royal family. Military personnel in dress uniform lined portions of the route, standing at attention as the cars passed. Members of the household cavalry on horseback accompanied the procession, their armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. The precision and pageantry of it all was breathtaking, a demonstration of British tradition and ceremony at its finest. As they approached Buckingham Palace, the crowds grew even denser. The area around the palace had been completely transformed. Giant screens had been erected for those unable to get close to the gates. Viewing platforms had been built for media from around the world. Security personnel were everywhere, coordinating an operation that involved thousands of officers working together seamlessly. The family's car passed through the palace gates, and suddenly they were sheltered from the crowds. The noise level dropped dramatically, and the children seemed to deflate slightly, the adrenaline of the public appearance beginning to wear off. They had been on for hours, maintaining their best behavior while the world watched. Now, in the relative privacy of the palace grounds, they could let their guard down slightly. But the day was far from over. The family was escorted inside the palace, where they would have a brief rest before the next major event. The famous balcony appearance awaited them, where the royal family would gather to wave to the crowds gathered outside and watch the Royal Air Force fly past. This tradition was beloved by the public and expected after major royal events. The children knew about this part of the schedule, though they didn't fully understand just how many people would be looking up at them. Inside Buckingham Palace, the family was taken to a private sitting room where they could rest before the balcony appearance. The room was elegant but comfortable, filled with antique furniture and portraits of previous monarchs looking down from the walls. Palace staff immediately brought refreshments, knowing that the children especially would need food and drinks after the long ceremony. Louis made a beeline for the sandwiches, his earlier nervousness completely forgotten in the face of his growing hunger. Charlotte ate more delicately, but Kate noticed she consumed just as much food as her younger brother. George took a plate but seemed too tired or overwhelmed to eat much. William loosened his collar and sat down heavily on one of the sofas. The emotional weight of the day was evident on his face. He had just watched his father become king, pledged his allegiance publicly, and guided his own children through one of the most important events in recent British history. Kate sat beside him, their shoulders touching in a gesture of silent support. They had maybe 20 minutes to recharge before the next public appearance, and both knew they needed to make the most of this brief respite. King Charles and Queen Camilla entered the room, still wearing their crowns and ceremonial robes. Despite the heavy regalia, King Charles immediately got down on one knee to be at eye level with his grandchildren. He asked them how they were doing and if they had understood what happened in the Abbey. Louis launched into an animated description of the ceremony that was more about the music and the pretty windows than the actual crowning. Charlotte asked if she could try on the Queen's crown, which made everyone laugh. George simply said he was proud of his grandfather, a statement delivered with such earnest sincerity that it brought visible emotion to the new king's face. Queen Camilla carefully removed her crown and set it on a table, sighing with relief. She told the children that crowns were beautiful but surprisingly heavy and uncomfortable. She let Charlotte touch the crown carefully, explaining about some of the jewels set into it. Louis wanted to touch it too, but was more interested in the way the diamonds caught the light. George stood back, content to observe rather than participate. His grandmother noticed his reserve and gave him a warm smile. understanding that he was processing the day in his own way. A palace aide entered the room and quietly informed the family that it was almost time for the balcony appearance. Kate immediately went into action, checking each child's appearance. Louis's collar was askew and Charlotte had somehow gotten a small stain on her dress. Kate worked quickly to straighten Louis and position Charlotte so the stain wouldn't be visible in photographs. She checked her own appearance in a mirror, adjusting her headpiece and smoothing her dress. William stood and rebuttoned his uniform jacket, transforming back into the formal Prince of Wales the public would expect to see. The family was guided through the palace corridors toward the famous balcony that overlooked the mall. As they walked, they could hear the roar of the crowds outside even through the thick palace walls. The sound was like distant thunder, constant and powerful. The children grew quiet, understanding that they were about to step back into the spotlight. Kate took Louis's hand firmly, knowing she would need to keep close control of him during this appearance. William walked beside George, ready to support his eldest son through whatever came next. They reached the set of doors that led to the balcony. Through the glass, they could see the backs of other royal family members who were already assembled outside. The system was carefully choreographed with the king and queen in the center, and other family members positioned according to their place in the line of succession and their importance to the monarchy. William and his family would stand close to the king and queen, reflecting William's position as heir to the throne. The doors opened, and the family stepped out onto the balcony. The roar of the crowd intensified immediately, a wave of sound so powerful it was almost physical. The children froze momentarily, overwhelmed by the sight before them. The mall stretched away from the palace, completely filled with people for as far as they could see. Hundreds of thousands of individuals, all waving flags and cheering, all there to celebrate the coronation. British flags waved like a red, white, and blue ocean. The sight was absolutely stunning and more than a little intimidating. Kate positioned the children in their designated spots. Louis stood between her and Charlotte, where both could keep an eye on him. George stood beside his father, the two of them presenting a powerful image of present and future kingship. William placed a gentle hand on his son's back, a subtle reminder that he was there and that George was not alone in this moment. The gesture was small but captured by telephoto lenses and would be analyzed in newspapers and on television for days to come. The family began waving to the crowds below. Charlotte's wave was picture-perfect, exactly as she had practiced. George waved more conservatively, his movements controlled and dignified. Louis waved with wild enthusiasm, his whole arm moving back and forth in great sweeping motions. At one point, he grabbed Kate's hand and tried to make her wave bigger too, which made her laugh despite the formal setting. That moment of genuine interaction between mother and son was caught on camera and immediately went viral on social media as people responded to the authentic family dynamic on display. King Charles stood at the center of the balcony with Queen Camilla beside him. He waved to his people with visible emotion, clearly moved by the overwhelming show of support. This was the culmination of a lifetime of preparation, decades of waiting, and now the reality of his reign was truly beginning. He glanced to his side where William stood with Kate and their children, seeing his legacy extending into the future. The image of 3 generations standing together on that balcony was powerful symbolism for the continuity of the monarchy. The Royal Air Force flypast had been scheduled, and everyone on the balcony scanned the skies waiting for the first aircraft to appear. The children had been told about this part of the celebration and were excited to see the planes. Louis bounced on his toes with anticipation, making it challenging for Kate to keep him in one place. Charlotte stood on her tiptoes, trying to see over the balcony's edge better. George craned his neck upward, searching the blue sky for any sign of the approaching aircraft. Then someone spotted them first, the distant shapes of aircraft approaching in precise formation. The sound of their engines began to build, growing louder as they drew nearer to the palace. The crowd's cheering intensified in anticipation. The children pressed forward against the balcony railing, not wanting to miss a second of the display. Kate kept a firm grip on Louis while also trying to watch the planes herself. William pointed out different aircraft types to George, sharing his knowledge and enthusiasm for military aviation. The Royal Air Force aircraft roared overhead in perfect formation, their precision a testament to countless hours of practice. The Red Arrows came last, trailing streams of red, white, and blue smoke across the sky, painting the Union Jack colors above Buckingham Palace. The children's faces tilted upward, their mouths open in awe at the spectacle unfolding above them. Louis pointed wildly at each plane, shouting observations that were lost in the noise of the engines and the crowd. Charlotte clapped her hands together in delight, her earlier composure giving way to childlike wonder. George watched with intense focus, memorizing every detail of this moment he would carry with him forever. The entire fly-past lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes felt suspended in time. The sound of the engines faded as the aircraft disappeared into the distance, and a different kind of quiet settled over the scene. The family remained on the balcony, waving to the crowds who showed no signs of leaving. People had traveled from across the United Kingdom and around the world to be part of this historic day, and they wanted to savor every possible moment. Some in the crowd had tears streaming down their faces, overcome with emotion at witnessing history. Others held up their phones and cameras, desperate to capture just one more photograph of the royal family standing together. Louis was growing restless again after the excitement of the planes had passed. He tugged at Kate's dress and whispered something to her. She bent down to hear him better, and whatever he said made her stifle a laugh. She whispered back to him, and he nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. William noticed the exchange and caught Kate's eye with a questioning look. She shook her head slightly, indicating it was nothing serious but that Louis was reaching his absolute limit of patience and good behavior. They had maybe 5 more minutes before a tantrum or meltdown became inevitable. King Charles seemed to sense the energy shifting among his grandchildren. He gave a subtle signal to the palace aides standing just inside the doors. The family would need to make their exit soon, but it had to be done in a way that didn't seem abrupt or disrespectful to the celebrating crowds. The art of royal public appearances included knowing exactly when to withdraw, leaving people wanting more rather than staying too long and diminishing the impact of the moment. The family gave one final coordinated wave to the crowds below. George waved with his right hand, looking every inch the future prince he was born to be. Charlotte performed a small curtsy that delighted the photographers stationed below. Louis waved with both hands at once, his exuberance uncontainable. Kate and William waved together, their free hands finding each other in a brief moment of connection that spoke volumes about their partnership. King Charles and Queen Camilla stood at the center, waving slowly and regally, the crowns on their heads catching the afternoon sunlight and sparkling brilliantly. Then, as smoothly as they had appeared, the family turned and walked back through the doors into the palace. The roar of the crowd continued behind them, but the thick palace walls muffled the sound almost immediately. The sudden quiet was almost shocking after hours of constant noise and stimulation. Louis immediately let out a huge breath and complained loudly that his feet hurt and he was tired. Charlotte admitted she was exhausted too, though she tried to maintain her composure. George said nothing, but his shoulders sagged with relief at being out of the public eye. Kate knelt down and gathered all 3 children to her in a group embrace. She told them how incredibly proud she was of each of them, how beautifully they had behaved, and how they had made the entire family look wonderful. William joined the embrace, wrapping his long arms around his wife and children. For a moment, they were just a family, not royals or public figures, just parents and children who had survived an exhausting and overwhelming day together. King Charles approached them, having removed his heavy crown and ceremonial robes. He looked tired but deeply happy, the stress of the ceremony giving way to satisfaction and relief. He thanked William and Kate for ensuring the children were so well prepared and well behaved. He told his grandchildren that they had done a magnificent job and that he was very proud of them. He promised that there would be a special treat later, as a reward for their excellent behavior. Louis perked up immediately at the mention of a treat, wanting to know what it would be. The king just smiled mysteriously and said they would have to wait and see. The family was guided to private quarters where they could truly relax for the first time all day. The children were allowed to remove their formal clothing and change into comfortable clothes they had brought for exactly this purpose. Louis immediately stripped off his jacket and tie, sighing with relief. Charlotte carefully hung up her dress, already understanding the value and significance of the garment she had worn. George changed more slowly, treating his uniform with the respect it deserved as a symbol of his position. Kate removed her elaborate headpiece and felt immediate relief from the weight she had been carrying on her head for hours. She changed into a simple dress and comfortable shoes, transforming from Princess of Wales back into simply Kate. William changed into casual clothing as well, the military uniform carefully hung up to be cleaned and stored. They looked at each other and shared a smile of pure relief. They had made it through one of the most important and challenging days of their lives. And their children had been absolutely wonderful. Food was brought to the private quarters, and the children ate with genuine hunger now that the pressure was off. They talked over each other, sharing their favorite moments from the day. Louis loved the plains best. Charlotte couldn't stop talking about the Queen's crown and how it sparkled. George admitted that seeing his grandfather crowned was amazing, but also a little scary because it made him think about his own future. William addressed this concern seriously, explaining that George had many years before he needed to worry about such things, and that when the time came, he would be ready because they would prepare him together. As evening approached, the family gathered in a comfortable sitting room with other members of the royal family. The formal atmosphere of the day had completely dissolved, replaced by the relaxed warmth of a family celebration. Children played together while adults conversed in small groups. Someone had arranged for a special cake decorated with the Coronation emblem, and the children were each given a piece. Louis got frosting on his nose, which made everyone laugh. Charlotte tried to eat her cake elegantly but ended up with frosting on her chin too. George ate his cake quickly and asked for a second piece, his appetite finally returning after the stress of the day. Kate and William found themselves sitting together on a sofa, watching their children interact with cousins and other family members. The day had been extraordinary, historic, and exhausting, but seeing their children happy and relaxed, hearing their laughter filling the room made all the challenges worthwhile. They had navigated an incredibly complex public event, while also being present as parents, protecting their children while allowing them to be part of something meaningful. As the evening wore on, the younger children began to show signs of serious fatigue. Louis's eyes were drooping despite his attempts to stay awake and keep playing. Charlotte yawned repeatedly, trying to hide it behind her hand. Even George, who had seemed to have endless energy, was moving more slowly. Kate and William exchanged a look that needed no words. It was time to take their children home. The family said their goodbyes to the king and queen and other relatives. There were hugs and kisses all around, final congratulations exchanged and promises to see each other again soon. King Charles held each grandchild a bit longer than necessary, clearly emotional about the role they had played in his coronation day. He whispered something to each of them privately, words meant only for their ears. Whatever he said made Louis giggle, brought a smile to Charlotte's face, and caused George to stand a bit taller. The drive back to Adelaide Cottage was quiet. The children were too tired to look out the windows at the crowd still celebrating in the streets. Louis fell asleep almost immediately, his head resting against Kate's shoulder. Charlotte tried to stay awake, but her eyes kept closing. George stared out the window but seemed to be looking inward rather than at the passing scenery, processing everything he had experienced. When they arrived home, William carried Louis inside while the boy continued sleeping. Kate guided Charlotte, who was moving like a sleepwalker. George walked under his own power but accepted his mother's steadying hand on his shoulder. They moved through their home quietly, the familiar surroundings a welcome contrast to the grandeur and formality of Westminster Abbey and Buckingham Palace. The children were helped into their pajamas and tucked into their beds. Kate sat with each child for a few moments, stroking their hair and telling them again how proud she was. William did the same, his voice soft and filled with love. By the time both parents had finished their rounds, all three children were sound asleep, exhausted by the most extraordinary day of their young lives. Kate and William retreated to their own room, finally alone together. They sat on their bed, neither one speaking, for several minutes. The magnitude of what they had witnessed and participated in was settling over them. William's father was now king,